I never thought my peaceful retirement in a gated community would turn into one of those HOA revenge stories you read about online. As a federal judge with 30 years on the bench, I'd spent my career upholding the law and seeking justice for others. I never imagined I'd need that same justice for my own family, especially not in the place we called home. My daughter Sarah, who's 12 and uses a wheelchair due to cerebral palsy, and I had moved into Willow Creek Estates 3 years earlier. The manicured lawns and pristine streets seemed like the perfect sanctuary after my demanding career. I'd even served on the HOA mediation committee briefly, hoping to use my legal background to help resolve neighborhood disputes fairly. That Tuesday afternoon started like any other. Sarah and I were enjoying the unseasonably warm October weather in our front yard. She loves watching the birds from her specially adapted wheelchair, and I cherish these simple moments with her. We'd just finished setting up her portable ramp when a shadow fell across us. "You can't have that monstrosity on your lawn," a shrill voice declared. I looked up to see Brenda Johnson, head of the HOA's architectural committee, standing with her arms crossed. Brenda was exactly what you'd imagine when you hear HOA Karen, perfectly coiffed hair, designer sunglasses perched on her head, and an expression of perpetual disapproval. "Brenda, this is just a temporary ramp," I explained calmly. "It's for Sarah's wheelchair. We'll remove it when we go back inside." "The rules are clear," she snapped, tapping her clipboard. "No structures of any kind on front lawns without prior approval. And this," she gestured at the ramp, "definitely wouldn't get approved." "It's not a structure, Brenda. It's a mobility aid for a disabled child," I said, feeling my patience wearing thin. "I don't care what it is. It violates the community standards," she insisted. "Remove it immediately, or I'll have to issue a fine." Sarah, who had been quietly watching, spoke up. "Please, Miss Brenda, I just want to watch the birds." Brenda turned her cold gaze to my daughter. "Well, maybe you should watch them from inside where you belong." Before I could respond, Brenda stepped forward and slapped Sarah across the face. The sound echoed in the quiet street. Sarah cried out, more from shock than pain, and I saw the red imprint of fingers on her cheek. Something inside me snapped. I moved between them, my voice trembling with rage. "You just assaulted a disabled child. In front of me, a federal judge." Brenda's face paled slightly, but she quickly recovered. "You're not on the bench now, Judge Harrison, and you're in violation of HOA rules. I'll be issuing fines for both the ramp and your hostile behavior." As she turned and walked away, I knelt beside Sarah, checking her face and comforting her as she sobbed. In that moment, I knew this wouldn't end with a simple apology. This was one homeowners association drama that would end with justice. If you're angry right now, comment HOA Karen below. I need to know I'm not alone in thinking this was unacceptable. That evening, after Sarah had finally fallen asleep, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, my hands still shaking. The image of Brenda slapping my daughter played on a loop in my mind. As someone who had spent decades in the legal system, I believe in due process and giving people a chance to make things right. I decided to try resolving this peacefully before bringing the full weight of my position into play. The next morning, I called the HOA office and requested a meeting with the full board. The administrator, a pleasant woman named Maria, seemed shocked when I briefly explained what had happened. "Oh my goodness, Judge Harrison," she said. "That's completely unacceptable. I've scheduled you for tomorrow at 5 p.m. The entire board will be there." I arrived at the community clubhouse early the next day, armed with documentation about Sarah's disability and our rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act. I wasn't planning to throw my weight around as a judge. I just wanted them to understand the situation and ensure nothing like this ever happened again. The board members were already seated when I entered, including Brenda, who sat at the head of the table looking smug. "Thank you for meeting with me," I began, keeping my voice level. "Yesterday, an incident occurred between Brenda Johnson and my daughter Sarah that I believe we need to address." Brenda interrupted before I could continue. "If this is about that ramp, I've already told you it's against community rules. And frankly, Judge, you, of all people, should respect rules and regulations." "This isn't about the ramp, Brenda," I said, my patience thinning. "This is about you assaulting my 12-year-old disabled daughter." The other board members exchanged concerned looks. A man named Tom Richards, who lived 2 doors down from me, leaned forward. "Brenda, did you slap Sarah?" Brenda waved her hand dismissively. "I barely touched her. The child was being hysterical, and I was trying to calm her down." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You slapped her across the face, Brenda. There were witnesses. Sarah has a handprint on her cheek." "Children exaggerate," Brenda said smoothly. "And frankly, Judge Harrison, your emotional attachment to this situation is clouding your judgment. As a board, we need to focus on the real issue: your continued violation of community standards." For the next 30 minutes, I tried to reason with them. I explained about Sarah's disability, showed them the ADA guidelines, and even offered to serve on a committee to review the HOA's policies regarding accessibility. But Brenda had clearly poisoned the well, and the other board members seemed reluctant to cross her. Finally, Tom spoke up again. "Look, Judge Harrison, we're sorry if Sarah was upset, but we do need to enforce the rules. If we make exceptions for one person, where does it end?" I looked around the room at the nodding heads and realized this wasn't going to be resolved through normal channels. Brenda had already spun her version of events, and without concrete evidence, it was my word against hers. "I understand your position," I said, standing up. "But I want it on record that I attempted to resolve this amicably, and I want to formally request that all HOA meetings be recorded going forward for transparency and accountability." Brenda smirked. "That's not necessary, Judge. We run a tight ship here." "We'll see about that," I replied, already planning my next steps. As I drove home, I thought about how many other homeowners had probably faced similar situations, powerless against petty tyrants like Brenda who abused their positions. I knew this wasn't just about Sarah anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been bullied by an HOA. What do you think happened next? Comment below with your predictions. The following week was hell. Sarah, usually cheerful despite her challenges, became withdrawn and anxious. She flinched whenever someone approached too quickly, and she refused to go outside, even in our fenced backyard. Her therapist told me she was showing signs of PTSD, which broke my heart. Meanwhile, the notices from the HOA began arriving. First, a $100 fine for the unauthorized structure, Sarah's ramp. Then another $150 for failure to comply with HOA directives. The third notice threatened legal action if I didn't remove all non-compliant elements from my property within 7 days. I called a lawyer friend of mine, Michael, who specialized in disability rights law. After listening to my story, he was incensed. "This is a clear violation of the ADA, Robert," he said. "Not to mention criminal assault. But what worries me most is the retaliation. They're clearly punishing you for speaking up." "I don't want to escalate this unnecessarily," I admitted. "Sarah's already been through so much." "Robert, they escalated it when Brenda slapped your daughter," Michael pointed out. "Now, they're escalating further with these bogus fines. You need to protect your family." He was right, of course. But I was still hesitant to reveal my position as a federal judge. I worried it would seem like I was throwing my weight around, something I'd spent my career avoiding. The tipping point came 2 days later. I was working in my home office when I heard Sarah scream from the living room. I rushed in to find 2 HOA contractors attempting to remove her wheelchair ramp. "What are you doing?" I demanded. One of the men looked uncomfortable. "We're just following orders, sir. Mrs. Johnson said it had to be removed today." Sarah was crying, clinging to her wheelchair. "Daddy, don't let them take it. I need it to get outside." I stepped between the contractors and the ramp. "This ramp is medically necessary equipment for my disabled daughter. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, you are legally required to provide reasonable accommodations. Removing this ramp would be a federal offense." The men exchanged nervous glances. "We're just doing our jobs, Judge." "I understand that," I said, my voice softer. "But you need to understand that removing this ramp would be illegal. Please tell Mrs. Brenda Johnson that if she attempts to remove it again, I'll be forced to take legal action." They left, but not before taking pictures of the ramp and my distraught daughter. I knew Brenda would use this as further ammunition against us. That night, Sarah had nightmares. I sat by her bed, holding her hand as she trembled in her sleep, and realized that my attempts to handle this quietly were only making things worse. My inaction was allowing Brenda to continue terrorizing my child. The next morning, I made a decision. I called Michael and asked him to help me prepare a formal complaint against the HOA. I also contacted the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which handles HOA violations in housing. But first, I needed to gather evidence. I installed security cameras around my property, focusing on areas where the HOA might try to access our yard. I also started documenting every interaction, every notice, every fine. The community's reaction was mixed. Some neighbors, like Tom from the HOA board, avoided me entirely. Others, like the elderly couple across the street, Mrs. Gable, quietly expressed their support. Brenda's been running this place like her personal kingdom for years, Mrs. Gable told me over the fence one afternoon. She's fined people for having the wrong shade of white curtains, for heaven's sake. No one's ever stood up to her. Why not? I asked. Most people just pay the fines to avoid the hassle, she explained. A few have fought back and lost. Brenda knows the bylaws inside and out, and she's not afraid to use them against anyone who crosses her. This information was troubling. If Brenda had been getting away with this kind of behavior for years, how many other people had she hurt? And how deep did her influence go? Has this ever happened to you or someone you know? Like, if yes. And share your experience in the comments. I spent the next few weeks buried in research. As a judge, I knew that knowledge is power, and I needed to understand every aspect of this situation before taking action. I requested copies of all HOA meeting minutes for the past 5 years, financial records, and the complete bylaws and covenants. What I discovered was shocking. Brenda had been systematically manipulating the HOA for years. She'd created numerous special committees that she personally chaired, giving her unprecedented control over community decisions. She'd also pushed through bylaw amendments that concentrated power in the architectural committee, which she headed. The financial records were even more telling. There were numerous questionable expenses, including payments to contractors who were relatives of board members, and legal fees that seemed excessive for a small community. But the most disturbing discovery was in the meeting minutes. Pattern after pattern of discriminatory enforcement. Fines issued to residents with disabilities for modifications that were clearly reasonable accommodations. Harassment of families with children for excessive noise during normal daytime hours. Even threats against homeowners who had dared to question Brenda's authority. I shared my findings with Michael, who was equally appalled. This goes way beyond a simple dispute, Robert, he said, shaking his head. This is a pattern of discrimination, and possibly fraud. We need to report this to the State Attorney General's office. I want to, but first I need to gather more evidence, I replied. I need to find other residents who've been targeted by Brenda. Over the next week, I discreetly reached out to neighbors who had been fined or sanctioned by the HOA. At first, people were hesitant to talk, afraid of retaliation. But when I explained what had happened to Sarah, their attitudes changed. One family, the Wins, had been fined $500 for installing a small ramp for their elderly mother. Another couple, the Millers, had been threatened with legal action over a wheelchair lift they'd installed for their son who had muscular dystrophy. The more people I talked to, the clearer the pattern became. Brenda was specifically targeting residents with disabilities, using the HOA's architectural rules as a weapon. Armed with this information, I filed a formal complaint with HUD and the State Attorney General's office. I also requested an emergency injunction to prevent the HOA from harassing my family or attempting to remove Sarah's ramp. But I knew legal action alone wouldn't be enough. I needed to expose Brenda's behavior to the entire community and force real change. That's when I remembered something Tom had mentioned during our disastrous HOA meeting. The annual HOA election was coming up in 2 months. If I could rally enough residents, we could vote out Brenda and her allies and install a new board that would respect residents' rights. I began organizing quietly, meeting with neighbors in small groups, sharing what I discovered, and building a coalition for change. To my surprise, many people were eager to help. They'd all been victims of Brenda's tyranny in one way or another, and were desperate for someone to lead the fight against her. As our movement grew, so did Brenda's retaliation. The fines increased, and she began spreading rumors about me in the community. But this time, I was ready for her. I documented everything, saving every notice, recording every conversation, and gathering witness statements. And then I found the document that would change everything. Buried in the HOA's archives was a letter from their original attorney, stating that all architectural modifications for accessibility purposes must be approved without delay or additional fees, in compliance with federal law. Brenda had deliberately hidden this letter from the board and residents. With this evidence, I had everything I needed to not only win my case against the HOA, but to expose Brenda's misconduct and potentially hold her personally liable for damages. Share this with someone who's dealt with HOA bullies. They need to know they're not alone and that there is hope. Armed with evidence and the support of a growing number of residents, I requested another meeting with the HOA board. This time, I came not as a homeowner seeking compromise, but as a citizen demanding justice. The meeting was held in the same clubhouse where I'd been dismissed weeks earlier. But this time, the room was different. Dozens of residents had come to observe, lining the walls and sitting in chairs brought in from other rooms. Brenda looked visibly unsettled by the turnout. I began by laying out the facts calmly and methodically. I presented the documentation of Brenda's slap against Sarah, with photographs and a statement from Sarah's therapist detailing the psychological impact. Then, I moved on to the pattern of discrimination, sharing story after story from residents who had been targeted for accessibility modifications. The Wynns and Millers were both in attendance, and they bravely spoke about their experiences. Finally, I presented the hidden legal opinion that proved Brenda had knowingly violated federal law. The evidence is clear, I concluded. Brenda Johnson has been systematically discriminating against residents with disabilities in violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act. She has abused her position on this board to harass and intimidate homeowners, and she has concealed legal advice that would have prevented these violations. Brenda was red-faced with anger. "This is ridiculous! I've done nothing wrong! These are all baseless accusations from people who don't want to follow the rules." "What about the letter from the original attorney, Brenda?" I asked, holding up the document. "The one that clearly states accessibility modifications must be approved without delay or fees. Why was this never shared with the board or residents?" She sputtered, clearly caught off guard. I don't know what you're talking about. That must be a forgery." "It's signed by the attorney and dated, Brenda," I said. "And I have a sworn affidavit from the board secretary at the time confirming it was received and filed by you personally." The room erupted in murmurs as residents realized the extent of Brenda's deception. Tom Richards, who had been silent throughout my presentation, finally spoke. "Judge Harrison, these are serious allegations. As chair of the ethics committee, I move that we place Brenda on immediate suspension pending a full investigation." Brenda's allies on the board protested, but they were outnumbered. The motion passed, and Brenda was officially suspended from her position on the board. I expected her to back down, but instead, she stood up and addressed the room. "This is nothing but a witch hunt, orchestrated by a man who thinks his position as a judge makes him above the rules. Well, I have news for you, Judge Harrison. The HOA has filed a lawsuit against you for non-payment of fines and violation of community standards. We'll see who's above the rules when we're in court." With that dramatic announcement, she stormed out of the room, leaving chaos in her wake. The remaining board members looked stunned. "We had no idea," one of them said. "Brenda handled all legal matters herself. We never saw any lawsuits." I nodded. "That doesn't surprise me, but I'm ready for her. I've already filed a countersuit for discrimination, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, and I've reported the HOA to HUD and the State Attorney General's office." The mood in the room shifted from shock to determination. Residents who had been afraid to speak up before now came forward with their own stories of Brenda's misconduct. By the end of the meeting, we had formed a committee to oversee the HOA's operations until the upcoming election, and I had agreed to serve as an advisor. As I left the clubhouse that evening, Mrs. Gable approached me. "You know, Judge, you never told us why you're so passionate about this. Most people would have just moved away rather than fight." I looked toward my house, where Sarah was waiting for me. "Because everyone deserves to feel safe in their own home, Mrs. Gable. Especially children. Especially children who've already faced so many challenges." She patted my arm. "Well, you're doing the right thing. We're all behind you." I nodded, grateful for the support but already thinking about the battle ahead. Brenda had escalated things by filing a lawsuit, and I knew she wouldn't give up without a fight. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt hopeful. Justice was coming, not just for Sarah and me, but for everyone Brenda had wronged. The HOA thought they were above the law. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The lawsuit arrived by certified mail 3 days later. As I read through the legal document, I couldn't help but admire the audacity of it. Brenda was suing me for $15,000 in fines and legal fees, claiming that Sarah's ramp had significantly decreased property values and created a hazardous condition in the community. What she didn't know was that I had been expecting this. Michael and I had already prepared a countersuit, which we filed the same day. We were seeking damages for discrimination, emotional distress, and violations of the ADA and Fair Housing Act. We were also requesting a court order to remove Brenda from her position on the HOA board permanently. The community was buzzing with news of the legal battle. Some residents were worried about the potential cost to the HOA, while others were furious that their dues were being used to fund Brenda's personal vendetta. At an emergency meeting of the new Oversight Committee, we discussed how to handle the situation. The HOA's insurance policy likely wouldn't cover damages resulting from discriminatory actions, which meant the community could be on the hook financially if we lost. "We need to settle this before it drains our reserves," said one committee member. I shook my head. Settling would mean admitting we did something wrong. We didn't. Brenda did. And if we settle, we're letting her get away with what she's done to so many people. "But what about the legal fees?" another member asked. "They could bankrupt the HOA. "That's a risk we have to take," I replied. Sometimes, doing the right thing isn't easy or cheap, but it's still the right thing. The committee agreed to support the legal fight, but tensions were high. Brenda still had allies in the community, and they weren't going down without a fight. The escalation came swiftly. Within a week, we received notice that the HOA, under Brenda's direction, had filed a complaint with the State Judicial Conduct Board, claiming I had abused my position as a judge to influence the HOA election and intimidate residents. The accusation was absurd, but it still had to be investigated. I found myself having to explain the situation to my superiors at the courthouse, who were supportive but concerned about the appearance of impropriety. "I know you would never abuse your position, Robert," said my chief judge, "but you need to be careful. This could get messy." "I understand," I replied, "but I can't back down. This is about protecting my daughter and standing up for what's right." He nodded. "Just keep me informed, and try to keep a low profile until this is resolved." Easier said than done. The next escalation was even more personal. One afternoon, I came home to find Child Protective Services at my door. They had received an anonymous report claiming I was neglecting Sarah's medical needs and using her disability to manipulate the system. The social worker was professional and kind, but the investigation was invasive and humiliating. Sarah was terrified, thinking she might be taken away from me. It took 2 days and numerous calls to Sarah's doctors and therapists to clear up the false report. I knew Brenda was behind this. It was exactly her style: underhanded, cruel, and designed to cause maximum emotional damage. That night, as I tucked Sarah into bed, she asked me, "Daddy, why is Mrs. Brenda being so mean to us?" I sat beside her, taking her small hand in mine. Some people, sweetheart, are afraid of what they don't understand. And when they're afraid, sometimes they try to hurt others. "But I didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice trembling. "I know you didn't," I replied, fighting back tears. "And neither did I. That's why we have to keep fighting, to make sure no one else has to go through this." She nodded, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. "I just want it to stop, Daddy." "So do I, sweetheart," I whispered, kissing her forehead. "So do I." As I left her room, I made a decision. I had tried to handle this quietly, out of respect for my position and the legal process, but Brenda had crossed a line when she involved Child Protective Services. It was time to bring the full weight of my authority and connections to bear on this situation. The next morning, I called a special meeting of the Oversight Committee. When they were all seated, I stood up and addressed them. "I've tried to handle this situation as a private citizen," I began. But Brenda Johnson has escalated this to a level that requires a different approach. It's time she learned exactly who she's dealing with. I paused, looking around the room at the curious faces. My name is Robert Harrison, I said, my voice steady. And I'm not just a homeowner in this community. I'm a federal judge for the United States District Court. And I'm done playing nice. The room fell silent as the weight of my words sank in. This was the turning point. The hidden power reveal that would change everything. The silence in the room lasted for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Tom Richards spoke, his voice filled with disbelief. You're a federal judge, as in an actual federal judge? I nodded. I've served on the federal bench for 15 years. Before that, I was a state prosecutor and then a superior court judge. Why didn't you tell us? Mrs. Nguyen asked. Why didn't you use your position to stop Brenda sooner? I sighed, running a hand through my hair. Because I believe in the process. I believe that everyone should be held accountable under the same laws, regardless of who they are or who they know. I didn't want to throw my weight around or use my position to intimidate anyone. I looked around the room at the stunned faces. But Brenda has crossed a line. She filed a false report with Child Protective Services, accusing me of neglecting my daughter. She's filed a frivolous lawsuit, wasting community resources. And she's systematically discriminated against residents with disabilities for years. It's time to end this. The mood in the room shifted from shock to determination. If they had been hesitant to fully support me before, knowing my position changed everything. What can we do? Tom asked. First, we need to call an emergency meeting of the full HOA membership, I replied. We need to present the evidence against Brenda and hold a vote to remove her from the board permanently. That could take weeks, one of the committee members pointed out. Not necessarily, I said. The bylaws allow for an emergency removal vote if a board member is accused of misconduct that could expose the HOA to legal liability. I believe Brenda's actions qualify. We scheduled the meeting for the following week. In the meantime, I reached out to some contacts in the U.S. Attorney's office, explaining the situation and asking for their advice on how to handle the ADA and Fair Housing Act violations. To my surprise, they were extremely interested in the case. It turned out that HUD had already received multiple complaints about Willow Creek Estates, but without specific evidence or a willing plaintiff, they hadn't been able to take action. Now, with my testimony and the evidence I'd gathered, they were prepared to launch a formal investigation. The week leading up to the meeting was tense. Brenda and her allies launched a smear campaign, spreading rumors about me and questioning my motives. They even suggested that I had planted the evidence against Brenda as part of some elaborate scheme to take over the HOA. But their tactics backfired. The more they attacked me, the more residents rallied to my side. People who had been afraid to speak up before now came forward with their own stories of Brenda's misconduct. By the day of the meeting, we had over 50 residents ready to testify against her. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, which was packed to capacity. Brenda arrived late, surrounded by her allies, looking confident and defiant. When it was my turn to speak, I laid out the case against her calmly and methodically. I presented evidence of discrimination, harassment, and financial misconduct. I shared stories from residents who had been victimized by her policies. And I revealed that HUD and the U.S. Attorney's Office were now investigating the HOA. The evidence is clear and overwhelming, I concluded. Brenda Johnson has abused her position, violated federal law, and brought this community to the brink of financial ruin. I move that she be immediately removed from the board and that all her decisions be reviewed for legality. The room erupted in applause and shouts of support. Brenda looked pale and shaken as she realized how much she had lost the support of the community. When the vote was called, it was nearly unanimous. Only Brenda and her two closest allies voted against her removal. As the meeting adjourned, Brenda approached me, her face a mask of fury. You think you've won, Judge? This isn't over. I'll sue you personally. I'll ruin your reputation. I held up my hand, cutting her off. Brenda, you've already done enough damage. To me, to my daughter, and to this community. It's time to accept that your reign of terror is over. She glared at me, then turned and stormed out, followed by her diminishing group of supporters. The remaining board members gathered around me, thanking me for my leadership and asking what we should do next. First, I said, we need to review and revise all HOA policies to ensure compliance with federal law, especially regarding accessibility. Second, we need to cooperate fully with the federal investigation. And third, we need to reach out to all residents who have been affected by Brenda's policies and make things right. Tom nodded. We'll need to raise special assessments to cover the legal fees and potential fines. I understand, I replied. But sometimes the cost of doing the right thing is high. It's a price we have to pay to move forward as a community. As I left the meeting that evening, I felt a sense of relief. The battle wasn't over yet, but we had won a crucial victory. Brenda was no longer in power, and the community was united in its commitment to change. But I knew Brenda wouldn't give up easily. She had too much pride and too much to lose, and she still had that lawsuit hanging over our heads. The war was far from over, but we had won this battle. And for the first time in months, I felt hopeful about the future. With Brenda removed from the board, we faced the monumental task of cleaning up the mess she had left behind. The new board, with Tom as interim president, worked tirelessly to review years of decisions, policies, and financial records. What they discovered was even worse than we had imagined. Brenda had been using HOA funds for personal expenses, including vacations, home renovations, and even cosmetic surgery. She had also awarded contracts to companies owned by her relatives and friends, often at inflated prices. The total amount of misappropriated funds was staggering, nearly 200 over 5 years. We turned this evidence over to the State Attorney General's office, which launched a criminal investigation. Brenda was formally charged with embezzlement and fraud, and her assets were frozen pending the outcome of the case. But the financial misconduct was only part of the story. As we delved deeper into the HOA's records, we uncovered a pattern of discrimination that was even more extensive than we had initially thought. Brenda had specifically targeted residents with disabilities, seniors on fixed incomes, and families with children, using the HOA's rules as weapons against them. With the help of the U.S. Attorney's Office, we began reaching out to these residents, offering to help them file complaints and seek compensation for the harm they had suffered. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of residents came forward with stories of harassment, intimidation, and financial hardship caused by Brenda's policies. One of the most heartbreaking cases involved an elderly veteran named Mr. Henderson, who had been fined repeatedly for parking his specially equipped van in his own driveway. The fines had accumulated to over 30, and Brenda had placed a lien on his home. When we explained that we were going to fight to get his money back, he broke down in tears. "I thought I was going to lose my home," he said, his voice trembling. "I served this country for 30 years, and I was going to lose my home over parking my van in my own driveway." Stories like Mr. Henderson's strengthened our resolve. We weren't just fighting for Sarah and me anymore. We were fighting for everyone who had been victimized by Brenda's reign of terror. As we built our case, the media got wind of the story. A local news station ran a piece on the situation at Willow Creek Estates, and soon, national outlets picked it up. The story resonated with people across the country who had experienced similar issues with their own HOAs. Our story went viral, and the support poured in. People from all over the country shared their own HOA horror stories, and legal experts offered their assistance pro bono. We even received a call from a U.S. senator who was interested in introducing legislation to reform HOA governance nationwide. The attention also brought pressure on Brenda to settle the lawsuit she had filed against me. With the criminal investigation and the mounting evidence against her, her position was increasingly untenable. Her attorney approached us with a settlement offer. Drop the countersuit and all complaints against her, and she would drop her lawsuit against me and the HOA. I presented the offer to the new board and to the residents who had joined our case. The reaction was unanimous. No settlement. "She needs to be held accountable for what she's done," Mrs. Wynne said. "A settlement lets her off too easily." I agreed. This isn't just about winning. It's about justice. And justice means Brenda has to face the consequences of her actions. With the community's support, we rejected the settlement and prepared for trial. Michael and his team worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, preparing witnesses, and building a comprehensive case against Brenda. As the trial date approached, The tension in the community was palpable. People were nervous about the outcome, worried about the financial impact on the HOA, and anxious about testifying in court. To ease their fears, I organized a meeting for all the residents involved in the case. I explained what to expect in court, answered their questions, and reassured them that they were doing the right thing. "I know testifying can be intimidating," I said, "but your testimony is crucial. It's not just about what Brenda did to you personally. It's about standing up for what's right and ensuring that this never happens again." Sarah, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "I'll testify too. I want everyone to know what Mrs. Brenda did to me." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to my brave daughter. I felt a surge of pride mixed with sadness that she had to go through this at all. "Are you sure, sweetheart?" I asked gently. She nodded, her expression determined. "I want to help. I don't want her to hurt anyone else's daddy or little girl." And in that moment, I knew we had already won. Regardless of the outcome of the trial, we had reclaimed our power, united our community, and shown that even the smallest voice can make a difference. The trial was set to begin in 2 weeks. We were ready. Brenda was about to learn that no one is above the law, not even HOA Karens. The day of the trial arrived with a sense of gravity and purpose. The courtroom was packed with residents from Willow Creek Estates, journalists, and legal observers. Brenda sat at the defendant's table with her attorney, looking pale and nervous. I sat at the plaintiff's table with Michael and our legal team, Sarah, beside me in her wheelchair. The judge entered, and the courtroom fell silent. I couldn't help but feel a sense of irony. Here I was, a federal judge myself, sitting as a plaintiff in a lawsuit. But this wasn't about my position or my authority. This was about justice for my daughter and everyone else Brenda had harmed. Michael began our case with an opening statement that laid out the pattern of discrimination, harassment, and financial misconduct. He emphasized the human cost of Brenda's actions, particularly the impact on Sarah and other vulnerable residents. "This isn't just about a ramp or fines or bylaws," he concluded. "This is about the right of every person to feel safe and respected in their own home. And that's a right that Brenda Johnson systematically violated." Brenda's attorney followed with a predictable defense. "Brenda was simply enforcing the rules. She had no ill intent, and this was all a misunderstanding orchestrated by me to advance my own agenda." When it was time for testimony, Sarah was our first witness. I watched with pride as she answered the questions clearly and calmly, describing the incident when Brenda slapped her and the fear she had felt since then. "Did you ever do anything to hurt Mrs. Johnson?" Michael asked. Sarah shook her head. "No, I just wanted to watch the birds in our yard." "Did you ever break any HOA rules?" "Only the ones about the ramp," Sarah replied. "But my daddy told me it was okay because I needed to get outside." One by one, other residents took the stand. The Newings, the Millers, Mr. Henderson, and many more told their stories of harassment, intimidation, and financial hardship caused by Brenda's policies. The cumulative effect was devastating. When it was my turn to testify, I described the incident with Sarah, the subsequent harassment, and the discovery of Brenda's misconduct. I also explained why I hadn't revealed my position as a federal judge earlier. "I believe in the process," I said. "I believe that everyone should be equal under the law, regardless of their position or status. I didn't want to use my authority to intimidate or influence the outcome. I wanted to let the facts speak for themselves." Brenda's attorney tried to paint me as a powerful figure abusing his position to settle a personal score, but the evidence didn't support his narrative. The documents, the testimony, and the pattern of behavior all pointed to one conclusion. Brenda had abused her power and violated the law. The turning point came when we called the HOA's former attorney to the stand. He testified that he had advised Brenda multiple times that her policies violated federal law, but she had ignored his advice and eventually fired him when he refused to support her position. "I told her that the ADA and Fair Housing Act required reasonable accommodations for residents with disabilities," he testified. "She told me that federal laws didn't apply to private communities like Willow Creek Estates. When I explained that they did, she accused me of being disloyal and terminated our contract." The look on Brenda's face when the attorney said this was priceless. She knew she had been caught, and there was no way to explain it away. In her testimony, Brenda came across as defensive and evasive. She denied slapping Sarah, claimed that all her decisions were made in the best interest of the community, and accused me of orchestrating a smear campaign against her. But under cross-examination, her story fell apart. Michael confronted her with document after document, email after email, proving that she had knowingly violated the law and concealed evidence from the board and residents. Finally, he asked her, "Did you or did you not receive a legal opinion stating that accessibility modifications must be approved without delay or fees in compliance with federal law?" Brenda hesitated, then said, "I don't recall." Michael produced the document, bearing Brenda's initials and a note indicating she had received and filed it. "This is your initials, correct? And this note indicates you received this document on March 15th of last year, correct?" Brenda was trapped. She had no choice but to admit that she had received and concealed the legal opinion. When closing arguments began, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Michael delivered a powerful summation, tying together all the evidence and testimony into a compelling narrative of abuse of power and violation of trust. "The evidence is clear and overwhelming," he concluded. "Brenda Johnson used her position on the HOA board to harass, intimidate, and discriminate against vulnerable residents. She violated federal law, concealed evidence, and misappropriated community funds. She caused real harm to real people, including a disabled child who simply wanted to watch birds in her own yard." He paused, looking directly at the jury. "The law exists to protect people like Sarah Wynne, like Mr. Henderson, like all the residents who came forward to testify. It exists to ensure that everyone has the right to feel safe and respected in their own home. Brenda Johnson violated that right, and she must be held accountable." Brenda's attorney delivered a lackluster closing argument, rehashing points that had already been discredited by the evidence. It was clear that even he knew the case was lost. The judge instructed the jury, and they retired to deliberate. It took them less than 2 hours to return with a verdict. The courtroom was silent as the foreman stood up. "We find the defendant, Brenda Johnson, liable for discrimination, harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act. We award the plaintiffs $500, $0 in compensatory damages, and $1 million in punitive damages." A collective gasp went through the courtroom, followed by applause. Brenda looked like she had been struck by lightning. Her attorney put a hand on her arm, but she shook it off, staring in disbelief at the jury. The judge wasn't finished, though. "In addition to the civil liability," he said, "I am referring this matter to the State Attorney General's Office for criminal prosecution. The evidence presented in this court suggests serious criminal conduct that cannot go unaddressed." Brenda's face went white as the implications sank in. Not only had she lost the lawsuit and been ordered to pay $1.5 million in damages, but she now faced criminal charges as well. As we left the courtroom, reporters surrounded us, asking for comments. I kept my statement brief. This verdict is not just about us. It's about every homeowner who has ever been bullied by an HOA. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. And it's about ensuring that no one is above the law. Sarah, surrounded by well-wishers, beamed with pride. "We did it, Daddy," she said, taking my hand. "We won." I hugged her, feeling a wave of emotion wash over me. "Yes, sweetheart," I replied. "We did, and now no one else will have to go through what we went through." The look on Brenda's face when she realized she had lost not just the lawsuit, but her reputation, her freedom, and her community's respect was something I will never forget. It was the look of someone who had finally been held accountable for their actions. And it was the most satisfying moment of justice I had ever witnessed. The weeks following the verdict were a whirlwind of activity. Brenda, facing both civil judgment and criminal charges, attempted to flee the country but was apprehended at the airport. Her assets was seized, and she was held without bail pending her criminal trial. The $1.5 million judgment was a hollow victory in some ways. We knew she would never be able to pay it in full. But the principle was what mattered. She had been held accountable, and that was worth more than any amount of money. At Willow Creek Estates, the transformation was remarkable. With Brenda gone and her allies either removed from the board or resigned, a new era of cooperation and community began. The new board, with Tom as president, worked tirelessly to revise the bylaws, create fair and transparent policies, and reach out to residents who had been harmed under Brenda's leadership. One of the first actions they took was to establish an accessibility fund to help residents with disabilities make necessary modifications to their homes. The fund was named after Sarah, in recognition of her courage and the role she had played in bringing about change. Sarah became something of a local celebrity. Residents who had once avoided us now stopped to chat, asked about her well-being, and thanked her for her bravery. She handled the attention with grace, often saying, "I just wanted to watch the birds. But I'm glad other kids like me can do that now, too." The media attention continued, with our story being featured on national news programs and in publication. We received letters and emails from people across the country who had faced similar situations with their HOAs, asking for advice and sharing their own stories. In response, I created a website called HOA Justice to provide resources and support for homeowners dealing with abusive HOAs. The site quickly became a valuable resource, with legal information, templates for complaints, and a forum where people could share their experiences and advice. The U.S. Senator who had contacted us earlier invited Sarah and me to testify before Congress about HOA reform. Standing before the Senate Judiciary Committee, I shared our story and advocated for stronger protections for homeowners against abusive HOAs. Sarah, speaking softly but clearly, told the senators, "No kid should be scared to play in their own yard. No grown-up should be scared they'll lose their home because they need a ramp or a wheelchair lift. Please make laws so this doesn't happen to anyone else." Her testimony brought tears to the eyes of many in the room, including several senators who later became co-sponsors of the Homeowner Protection Act, which strengthened oversight of HOAs and provided better remedies for victims of discrimination and harassment. Back at Willow Creek Estates, life settled into a new normal. The community held a celebration to honor Sarah and all the residents who had come forward to share their stories. There was food, music, and a special ceremony where Sarah was presented with a key to the community and a plaque honoring her courage. As I watched my daughter accept these honors with a shy smile, I felt an overwhelming sense of pride and gratitude. We had turned a terrible experience into something positive, not just for ourselves, but for countless others across the country. The criminal trial of Brenda Johnson concluded with her being found guilty on multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and civil rights violations. She was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution to the HOA and to the residents she had harmed. When the sentence was announced, there was a sense of closure, but also a lingering sadness. It was tragic that someone with so much power had chosen to use it to harm others rather than to help them. But justice had been served, and that was what mattered. In the months that followed, I was approached by several publishers interested in turning our story into a book. I was hesitant at first, worried about exploiting Sarah's experience for profit. But when I asked her what she thought, she surprised me. "I think we should do it, Daddy," she said. "Then maybe more people will know about what happened, and more kids like me will be safe." So we agreed to write a book, with all proceeds going to organizations that support accessibility rights and victims of discrimination. As I sat at my desk one evening, working on the book, Sarah wheeled into the room. "What you doing, Daddy?" "Just writing about everything that happened," I replied. "About how brave you were." She came closer and looked at the screen. "Is it almost done?" "Not quite, sweetheart," I said. "But it will be soon." "Good," she said. "Then we can go watch the birds. I saw a new one today. It was blue with red on its wings." I smiled, closing the laptop. "That sounds wonderful. Let's go right now." As we went outside to the yard, where Sarah's ramp was now a permanent fixture, approved by the new HOA board without hesitation, I thought about how far we had come. We had faced injustice, stood up to it, and emerged stronger. We had turned our pain into purpose, our struggle into strength. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all. A year has passed since the trial, and Willow Creek Estates is almost unrecognizable as the place we once called home. Not physically, but in spirit. The atmosphere of fear and suspicion that hung over the community like a dark cloud has been replaced by one of cooperation and mutual respect. The new HOA board, with Tom still serving as president, has implemented numerous reforms based on the recommendations from the federal investigation. All board meetings are now recorded and open to all residents, with minutes posted promptly online. Financial decisions require multiple approvals and are subject to regular audits. Most importantly, the architectural review process has been completely overhauled to ensure compliance with federal accessibility laws. Sarah's Accessibility Fund has grown through donations and fundraising events and has already helped 12 families make necessary modifications to their homes. The MWAM finally got their ramp for Mrs. Wynn's mother, and Mr. Henderson no longer has to worry about being fined for parking his van in his own driveway. The community has embraced a new motto, suggested by Sarah during the celebration, "Every home welcome, every neighbor valued." It's painted on a sign at the entrance to the development, a constant reminder of the values we now hold dear. Our story continues to have an impact beyond Willow Creek Estates. The Homeowner Protection Act passed Congress with bipartisan support and was signed into law by the President. The legislation strengthens oversight of HOAs, provides better remedies for victims of discrimination and harassment, and requires HOAs to undergo regular training on federal accessibility laws. I've been invited to speak at conferences and events across the country, sharing our story and advocating for homeowners' rights. Sarah often joins me, and her simple, powerful words never fail to move audiences. OAs should help people, not hurt them, she told a crowd of housing advocates last month. They should make neighborhoods better, not scarier. Everyone deserves to feel safe in their own home. Our book, Every Home Welcome, A Judge's Fight for Justice Against HOA Tyranny, became a bestseller, and we've used the proceeds to establish a foundation that provides legal assistance to homeowners facing abusive HOAs. We've already helped dozens of families fight back against unfair fines, discriminatory policies, and board members who abuse their power. The media attention has faded somewhat, but we still receive occasional requests for interviews. A documentary film crew has been following us for the past few months, working on a film about HOA reform and the broader implications of our case. Sometimes, when I'm tucking Sarah into bed at night, she asks about Brenda. "Where is she now, Daddy? Is she still in jail?" I always answer, honestly, but gently, "Yes, sweetheart. She's still serving her sentence for the things she did." "Do you think she's sorry?" Sarah asks. "I hope so," I reply. Not just because she got caught, but because she understands now how much she hurt people. Sarah thinks about this for a moment, then says, "I hope she gets better, so she doesn't hurt anyone else when she gets out." I hug her, marveling at her capacity for forgiveness. "That's a very kind thing to say, sweetheart. You have a good heart." The aftermath of our ordeal hasn't been without challenges. The legal fees, even with Michael working pro bono, were substantial. The HOA had to raise special assessments to cover the costs of the investigation and the implementation of new policies. Some residents resented the financial burden, even though they agreed with the need for change. There were also personal challenges. Sarah still has moments of anxiety, especially when she encounters someone who reminds her of Brenda. We've continued with her therapy, and she's made remarkable progress, but the scars of that experience will always be with her. For me, the experience has changed how I view my role as a judge. I've always believed in justice and the rule of law, but now I have a deeper understanding of how the law intersects with everyday life, how seemingly small decisions can have profound impacts on people's lives. I've become more involved in accessibility issues in my courtroom, ensuring that people with disabilities have full access to the justice system. I've also started mentoring young lawyers who are interested in housing rights and disability law, passing on what I've learned. Perhaps most surprisingly, I agreed to serve on the HOA board at Willow Creek Estates, but only after the bylaws were amended to include term limits and other safeguards against abuse of power. It felt strange at first, being on the other side of the table, but it's been rewarding to help shape policies that protect residents rather than harass them. Tom and I often joke about how far we've come. "Who would have thought," he said to me at a recent board meeting, "that the quiet judge who moved in a few years ago would end up leading a revolution?" I smiled. "I didn't set out to lead a revolution, Tom. I just wanted my daughter to be able to watch birds in our yard without being afraid." "Well, you did more than that," he replied. "You changed this community. And judging by the emails and calls we still get, you've changed a lot of other communities too." Looking back on everything that's happened, I'm struck by how a single act of cruelty, a slap across a child's face, could set in motion such profound change. It's a reminder that even the smallest actions can have far-reaching consequences, for good or for ill. Brenda's act of violence set us on a path of conflict and struggle, but it also led us to a place of greater understanding, compassion, and justice. And in the end, that's what I hope people remember from our story. Not the pain and the struggle, but the possibility of redemption and renewal that lies on the other side. As I sit on my porch watching Sarah chase butterflies in the yard, something she can do easily now thanks to the smooth pathways and accessible features we've added, I find myself reflecting on the journey we've been through. It's been nearly 2 years since Brenda slapped my daughter, and so much has changed. I've learned many lessons from this experience. Lessons I hope others can learn from without having to go through what we did. The first and most important is the power of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult or scary. When Brenda first slapped Sarah, my instinct was to protect my daughter and avoid conflict. But avoiding conflict only allowed the abuse to continue. It wasn't until we stood up and said no more that things began to change. The second lesson is the importance of documentation. From day one, I kept records of every interaction, every notice, every fine. I took photographs, saved emails, and gathered witness statements. That documentation became the foundation of our case, providing irrefutable evidence of Brenda's misconduct. If you're dealing with an abusive HOA, document everything. It's your best protection. Third, I learned the value of community. We didn't win this fight alone. We had the support of neighbors who came forward with their own stories, legal professionals who offered their expertise, and even strangers who reached out after hearing our story. There is power in numbers, and there is strength in unity. If you're facing an unjust situation, reach out to others. You may be surprised at how many people are willing to stand with you. Fourth, I learned about the importance of knowing your rights. Many of the residents at Willow Creek Estates didn't realize that the HOA's policies violated federal law. They simply accepted the fines and restrictions, assuming that the HOA had the authority to enforce them. But homeowners have rights, and there are laws in place to protect those rights. Educate yourself about the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Fair Housing Act, and your state's HOA regulations. Knowledge is power. Fifth, I learned that change is possible, even in systems that seem entrenched and unchangeable. HOAs can be bureaucratic, resistant to change, and dominated by people who have held power for a long time. But with persistence, organization, and a commitment to justice, even the most entrenched systems can be reformed. Don't accept the status quo if it's unjust. Work to change it. Finally, I learned about the healing power of turning pain into purpose. Our experience with Brenda was traumatic, especially for Sarah. But by channeling that pain into advocacy and action, we've been able to find meaning and purpose in what happened. We've helped others, changed laws, and made our community a better place. That doesn't erase the pain, but it transforms it into something positive. To anyone dealing with an abusive HOA, I offer this advice. Document everything. Know your rights, reach out for support, and don't be afraid to stand up for yourself. You may face challenges and setbacks, but justice is worth fighting for. And to HOA board members, I offer this reminder. With power comes responsibility. You have been entrusted with the well-being of your community. Use that power wisely, fairly, and compassionately. Remember that the rules you enforce affect real people with real lives, real challenges, and real feelings. As for Sarah and me, we're doing well. Sarah has started middle school, where she's thriving with the support of teachers and friends who appreciate her for exactly who she is. She still loves watching birds, and our yard is now a certified wildlife habitat, filled with feeders, bird baths, and native plants that attract a variety of feathered visitors. I've continued my work on the bench, but with a renewed sense of purpose and a deeper understanding of the human impact of the law. I've also become an advocate for HOA reform, speaking at conferences, testifying before legislative bodies, and working with organizations that promote homeowners' rights. Our story has had a ripple effect that continues to spread. We receive emails regularly from people across the country who have been inspired by our experience to stand up to their own HOAs. Some have succeeded in changing policies. Others have removed abusive board members. And still others have simply found the courage to speak up. Each of these victories, large and small, honors the struggle we went through and gives meaning to Sarah's pain. They are reminders that even the smallest voice can make a difference, and that justice, though sometimes slow, will eventually prevail. As the sun sets on another beautiful day at Willow Creek Estates, Sarah wheels over to where I'm sitting on the porch. "Look, Daddy," she says, pointing to a bird feeder where a bright red cardinal has landed. "It's Mr. Cardinal. He comes every day now." I smile, putting my arm around her shoulders. "He knows he's welcome here." Sarah leans her head against my shoulder. "Everyone is welcome here now, aren't they, Daddy?" "Yes, sweetheart," I reply, my heart swelling with pride. "Everyone is welcome here now." And in that moment, I know that all the struggle, all the pain, all the fighting was worth it. We didn't just win a case or change a few policies. We helped create a community where everyone truly is welcome, where every neighbor is valued, and where no child has to be afraid to watch birds in their own yard. That, I realize, is the true meaning of justice. And it's a legacy I'm proud to leave, not just for Sarah, but for all the families who call Willow Creek Estates home. If you've ever dealt with HOA bullies, share this story with someone who needs to know they're not alone. And if you're facing an unfair HOA situation right now, remember that you have rights, you have power, and you don't have to fight alone. What do you think should happen to HOA board members who abuse their power? Let me know in the comments below. And if you have your own HOA horror story, please share it in the comments. Your experience might help someone else who's going through something similar. Finally, what's one change you'd like to see in how HOAs operate? Share your ideas. Together, we can make a difference.